McCormick Place in Chicago has a way of making you feel microscopic. But tonight, under the blinding white spotlights of the grand ballroom, I've never felt more visible. I stood in the wings, the heavy velvet curtain pressing against my shoulder, listening to the rhythmic, thundering roar of 2,000 people applauding a name I had spent years trying to justify. On the massive LED screen behind the podium, the logo for Apex Medical Diagnostics pulsed in a sterile, confident blue, and beneath it, in font so large it felt like a physical weight, were the numbers, 14500,000 yuan. My phone, tucked into the pocket of my navy blazer, hummed with a frantic, persistent vibration. I didn't need to look at the screen to know whose name was lighting up the display. It was Harrison Vance, my father. Just 7 days ago, that same man had looked at me across a table, laden with turkey and cranberry sauce, and told me I was a waste of a good education and a stain on the family legacy. He had called my dreams a delusion, and my prototype a plastic toy, before effectively erasing my seat at the table. Now, the wire services had picked up the acquisition news, and suddenly, the failure he had tried to bury was the most valuable asset in the room. The irony tasted like copper in my mouth. I watched the CEO of Apex step toward the microphone to introduce me, and I felt a strange, cold stillness settle in my chest, the kind of silence you only find in a lab at 3:00 inches the morning when the data finally proves everyone else wrong. My name is Clara Vance. I'm 31 years old, and tonight, I'm finally walking into the light, even if it means leaving the people who were supposed to love me in the dark. I am Clara Vance. I am 31 years old, a biochemical engineer by training, and according to the legal documents I signed just hours ago, I am now the founder of a technology that everyone I grew up with insisted was a delusional waste of life. It is a strange thing to stand in a room full of the world's most brilliant diagnostic minds and realize that the only people who don't believe you belong there are the people who share your DNA. The $145 million buyout is public now. It's scrolling across every major financial ticker, turning the name Vance into a synonym for innovation. But I'm not here to talk about the money. I'm here to tell you the secret behind that number, the secret of the plastic pen that was once covered in mashed potatoes, and the sister-in-law who thought she could erase my existence with a single LinkedIn post. But before I take you back to the cold rain of that Chicago night, I want to ask you something. What time is it for you right now as you're hearing my voice? Is the world quiet enough for you to finally listen? And what is the weather like where you are? Out here, the wind is howling off Lake Michigan, biting and relentless. It's the kind of cold that settles in your bones and reminds you of every time you were left standing outside. Does the sky outside your window match the mood in your chest tonight? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel, and how many of you have sat at a table where your heart was offered up as a joke for the amusement of people who were supposed to be your sanctuary. The truth is, I spent a decade being the difficult child, the expensive burden whose medical history and academic pursuits were treated like a drain on the family's collective stability. My family thought they had written the final chapter of my life on Thanksgiving when they told me to get out. They thought they held the final word because they held the house keys and the social standing. But they forgot that engineers are trained to analyze structural failures, and I had finally realized that the Vance family legacy wasn't a foundation. It was a crumbling facade held together by my own silence. My father's name is still lighting up my phone, but I've learned that answering a call doesn't mean you're listening. I'm done being the girl who begs for a seat. I've built my own table now, and I'm about to show you exactly how I laid the first brick. I've reached a point where I can look at the lake and feel the wind without shivering, but to understand how I got here, you have to understand the house I grew up in. In the Vance household, love was never a sentiment. It was a strategic allocation of capital. My father, Harrison, didn't view his children as human beings with beating hearts. He viewed us as line items in a long-term investment portfolio. Marcus was the blue-chip stock, the guaranteed return, the future CEO. The son whose every whim was a business expense the family was happy to cover. I, on the other hand, was the high-maintenance liability, The girl whose interests in chemistry and molecular structures were dismissed as expensive hobbies that cluttered up the garage with smelly jars and useless glass. I remember Marcus's 16th birthday with a clarity that still stings. There was a black BMW sat in the driveway, tied with a silver ribbon that caught the afternoon sun. I watched through the window as my father handed him the keys with a look of pure, unadulterated pride. A look I had spent my entire life trying to earn and failing. That same afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the scratching of my cheap ballpoint pen, the only sound in the room as I filled out FAFSA forms and student loan applications, entirely on my own. When I asked my father if he could help me understand the interest rates, he didn't even look up from his financial journals. "Marcus is going to Wharton, Clara," he said, his voice flat and clinical. "We have to prioritize the investments that actually move the family forward. You're smart enough to figure out how to pay for your little science experiments yourself." That was the foundation of our injustice. Marcus was the investment, and I was the expense. While my mother, Eleanor, spent her weekends decorating Marcus's path with gold leaf, ensuring he had the right clothes, the right tutors, and the right image, I was working double shifts at a local pharmacy just to afford the lab fees for my senior year. Marcus grew up with the smugness of a man who believed he was a winner because he'd never been allowed to lose. He looked at my stained lab coats and my calloused hands, not with sympathy, but with a refined, inherited contempt. To him, my struggle wasn't proof of my work ethic, it was proof of my inferiority. My father's checkbook was always open for Marcus's networking dinners, but it was locked tight when I needed a new microscope. This wasn't just favoritism, it was a structural erasure of my worth. They had decided who I was before I ever had a chance to become her, and they built a world where Marcus was the sun and I was just expected to stay in his shadow, silent and grateful for the scraps of warmth they left behind. The air in Chicago was turning razor sharp that November, but the chill inside my parents' Lake Forest estate was always far more clinical, a regulated atmosphere where every emotion was filtered through the lens of social standing. Thanksgiving dinner was never just a meal. It was a carefully choreographed performance of the Vance success story, a theater where Marcus was the lead and I was merely a stagehand. The dining room was suffocatingly opulent, the scent of slow-roasted turkey and sage competing with the cloying fragrance of Eleanor's expensive lilies. I sat there, draped in a dress I had bought secondhand, feeling like a glitch in their high-definition world. My hands, still stained at the cuticles with the stubborn gray resin from a 2:43 a.m. soldering session, were hidden beneath the heavy white linen tablecloth. I had reached a breaking point with the silence. I had spent years being the expense, the quiet failure, and I foolishly thought that perhaps, if I showed them the physical manifestation of my labor, they would finally see the engineer and not just the liability. When the conversation pivoted as it always did to Marcus's latest acquisition in the tech sector, I felt a surge of desperate courage. I reached into my bag and pulled out the SafeBite pen. It was a crude, 3D, printed thing, the gray plastic nutney, cracked at the edges, a stark, ugly contrast against the Waterford crystal and the heavy silver flatware. The silence that followed wasn't curious, it was allergic. My mother, Eleanor, didn't even look at the device. Her gaze fixed instead on my fingers as I adjusted the prototype on the table. I saw her nostrils flare, that signature look of refined disgust she reserved for things that didn't fit her aesthetic. "Clara," she whispered, her voice like a velvet noose. "Look at your hands. They're filthy. Did you really think it was appropriate to bring a piece of hardware, a piece of plastic junk to a holiday table?" She looked at me as if I were a stain on the tablecloth she couldn't quite bleach out. Marcus didn't even stop chewing. He just smirked, a patronizing glint in his eyes that told me he was already composing the joke he'd tell his friends later. My father, Harrison, didn't lean in to inspect the sensor or ask about the electrochemical calibration. He simply sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 31 years of disappointment, and checked his Rolex. "We are trying to have a civilized evening, Clara," he said, and the air left my lungs. "Put that monstrosity away before you embarrass your brother further." No one at this table is interested in your hobbies. We deal in reality here, not garage sale fantasies. I looked down at the pen, the rough plastic biting into my palm, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to apologize. I felt the first cold spark of a fire that was about to burn their entire theater to the ground. I tried to find my voice, but it felt like swallowing glass. I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, and tried to explain the why. I told them about the electrochemical sensors, the microneedles, and the algorithm that could detect a lethal concentration of peanuts or shellfish in under 3 seconds. I told them about Chloe's son, whose throat had closed up so fast his face turned the color of an eggplant while my mother had simply stood there, frozen, insisting her kitchen was safe. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about a career. It was about the terror of every parent who has ever had to hand their child a lunchbox like it was a live grenade. But the more I spoke, the more I saw the wall of their indifference thicken. Marcus didn't wait for me to finish. He leaned in, his silk tie dipping perilously into the gravy boat, and his face twisted into that practiced, frat boy grin that had always been his weapon of choice. He didn't just disagree with me. He wanted to defile the effort. With a slow, deliberate movement, he took his heavy silver serving spoon, heaped it with a massive, dripping mound of buttery mashed potatoes, and smeared it directly onto the sensor tip of the SafeBite pen. The sound of the spoon scraping against the 3D printed plastic was deafening in the quiet room. "There," Marcus whispered, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, childish malice. "Now it's finally useful for something. It can be a garnish." I stared at my life's work, now smothered in yellowed, lukewarm starch. It was a physical violation. I looked at my mother, Eleanor, expecting her to gasp, to scold him for his immaturity, or at least to offer a napkin. Instead, she reached for her wineglass, her gaze fixed firmly on the floral centerpiece, as if I were the one who had made the evening uncomfortable by existing. The true blow, however, came from the head of the table. Harrison Vance didn't scold Marcus. He didn't even flinch at the cruelty. He simply nodded, a slow, approving gesture that felt like a death sentence to my relationship with him. "Marcus is right, Clara," he said, his voice as cold and flat as a slab of granite. "If your little toy can't even survive a serving of potatoes, how do you expect it to survive a market? You're 31, and you're still playing pretend while your brother is actually building a legacy. This isn't betrayal, Clara. It's a reality check. You've been a financial and emotional drain on this family long enough. Consider this dinner your final notice." In that moment, the mashed potatoes clinging to the plastic ridges felt like a symbol of everything I had ever offered, them muddled, discarded, and treated like waste. The leash finally snapped. The silence in my chest wasn't empty anymore. It was a vacuum, ready to pull their entire world into the void. The sound of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor felt like a gunshot in that suffocating dining room. I didn't wait for my father to elaborate on his final notice, nor did I look at my mother as she carefully spooned a pea into her mouth, her eyes fixed on the silver candelabra as if I had already ceased to exist. I walked out, my heels clicking a sharp, lonely rhythm, through the marble foyer that had never truly felt like home. I went straight to the garage, my sanctuary, my lab, and began packing the only things that mattered. I didn't take the designer coats or the jewelry they had bought to make me look like a proper Vance. I took my soldering iron, my journals, and the SafeBite prototype, which I had wiped clean with a rag, though the faint yellow stain of the potatoes remained etched into the crevices of the 3D, printed plastic like a scar. By the time I hauled my 2 suitcases to the heavy oak front doors, the Chicago sky had finally broken. The rain wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a cold, needles, sharp downpour that turned the Lake Forest Drive into a gray blur. My father stood in the doorway, the warm, golden light of the mansion spilling out behind him, framing him as the master of a world I was no longer permitted to inhabit. He didn't offer an umbrella. He didn't offer a car. He simply watched, his arms folded across his chest, as I struggled to load my life into my aging sedan. "You're making a choice, Clara. he called out over the wind, his voice devoid of any parental warmth. Don't come back when you realize that pride doesn't pay the rent. I drove until the lights of the estate disappeared in my rearview mirror, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. I pulled into the parking lot of a 2-4-hour diner, the neon sign flickering a sickly green against the wet asphalt. I sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, and pulled out my phone. That was when the second blow landed, the one intended to ensure I could never work in this industry again. Marcus had wasted no time. My screen was flooded with notifications from LinkedIn, the professional network where our family's reputation was guarded like a fortress. There it was, at the top of my feed, a high-resolution photo Marcus had taken of the SafeBite pen, smothered in mashed potatoes. His caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive cruelty. So proud of my sister Clara for her innovation. Sometimes the hardest part of being a mentor is watching someone you love choose a garage sale fantasy over a stable career. Here's to the SafeBite, the world's most expensive garnish. The comments were a bloodbath, but the one that stopped my heart came from Julian Sterling, my former supervisor at the Research Institute. Julian, the man who had taught me electrochemical sensing, wrote, "I saw this coming a year ago. Some researchers are built for the lab. Others are just built for attention. It's a shame when ego replaces ethics." It was a calculated assassination of my character, validated by the very people who were supposed to be my foundation. Sitting in that dark car, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, I realized they weren't just kicking me out of their house. They were trying to lock every door in the city. But as I stared at the screen, a cold, crystalline stillness settled over me. They had used their power to make me a joke, but they had also just given me the only thing I truly needed, the freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. The apartment was a $850 a month studio in a part of Chicago where the streetlights hummed with a nervous flicker and the radiator clanked like a dying engine every time the temperature dipped below zero. It was a brutal, concrete box that smelled of stale coffee, flux, and the sharp, metallic tang of solder. After the Lake Forest mansion, with its heated floors and silent air filtration, this place felt like a sensory assault, but it was the first space in 31 years where the air didn't feel heavy with someone else's expectations. I had exactly $4,000 left in my savings money. I had scraped together from freelance consulting, and every cent was a ticking clock. I spent my days working as a lab technician for a generic testing facility to pay the rent, but my real life began at 10:00 p.m. That was when the world went quiet, and I could sit at the scarred wooden desk I'd found on a sidewalk, surrounded by the guts of my invention. By 2:43 a.m., the line between my exhaustion and my focus would blur into a singular, crystalline obsession. I wasn't building SafeBite to prove my father wrong anymore. That motivation had burned out in the rain on the night he kicked me out. I was building it because the science was real, and because I was tired of living in a world where the Julian Sterlings and Marcus Vances of the world got to decide what was useful. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. It was during one of these graveyard sessions at a local makerspace, a gritty warehouse full of discarded tech and brilliant misfits, that I met Eris Thorne. He was a hardware engineer who looked like he hadn't slept since the late 90s, with a permanent scowl and hands that could calibrate a sensor by feel alone. He had been watching me work on the electrochemical interface of the SafeBite prototype for 3 nights before he finally spoke. He didn't offer a greeting. He just pointed a grease-stained finger at my breadboard and said, "Your signal-to-noise ratio is garbage because your grounding is looped. Fix the trace, and the sensor will stop lying to you." I didn't take offense. In the world of high-stakes engineering, Truth is the only currency that matters. We spent the next 6 hours rerouting the circuitry. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being managed or patronized. I was being challenged by an equal. When we finally got a clean reading on a minute concentration of almond protein, Eris leaned back, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me with a terrifyingly sharp clarity. "The Vances of the world deal in narratives, Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They sell the idea of success. But data? Data doesn't have an ego. It doesn't care who your father is or how much Marcus's suit cost. If this works, it's going to dismantle everything they've built on lies. Don't let mediocre people convince you that your genius is a burden just because they can't see the math behind it." That night, walking back to my freezing studio, I felt a shift in the tectonic plates of my identity. I realized that my family hadn't rejected my invention. They had rejected the fact that I was the only one capable of creating it. Eris didn't give me hope, he gave me confirmation. I wasn't a waste of life. I was the architect of a reality they were too small to inhabit. As I sat on my apartment floor, cleaning a fresh circuit board while the sun began to pale the Chicago skyline, I made a silent vow. The next time the Vance family heard my name, it wouldn't be as a daughter begging for a seat, but as the person who held the deed to the ground they stood on. The 243A. Silence in that studio wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical space where my new life began to take shape amidst the scent of ozone and the rhythmic hum of my laptop's cooling fan. For months, I had been fueled by a cold, jagged anger toward Harrison and Marcus, a desperate, clawing need to stand on a stage and watch their faces crumble as I proved them wrong. But as the Chicago winter deepened, that spite began to feel heavy and unproductive, like a low-grade fever that blurred the data. The shift happened on a Tuesday night when an envelope arrived from Chloe, the friend whose son, Leo, had almost died because of my mother's careless assurance at a dinner party years ago. Inside was a crayon drawing of a superhero with a SafeBite logo on his chest and a short, shaky note from Chloe. She wrote, "Leo took his SafeBite prototype to a school birthday party today. He told me it's the first time he didn't feel like a sick kid sitting in a corner while everyone else ate. He felt safe because of you, Clara." I sat on my apartment floor, the radiator clanking beside me, and I wept not for the girl who was kicked out of her father's house, but for the clarity that Leo's letter provided. I realized then that my useless invention was never about the Vance family legacy or winning a dinner table argument. It was about Leo. It was about the millions of people who lived in a state of constant, low-level terror every time they picked up a fork. My motivation shifted from a screw you to a for them, and with that shift came a new, calculated kind of coldness. I knew Marcus and Julian Sterling believed they had won. I knew they were likely scouring my old research logs from the Institute, trying to reverse engineer the plastic toy they had mocked. They thought they knew my mind, but they were still looking at the version of me that was smothered in mashed potatoes. Working with Eris in the dead of night, I moved beyond the original breadboard design. We developed a proprietary nanofilter, a secret shield that solved the false positive issues my old research had struggled with. I didn't tell a soul outside that studio. While Marcus was busy branding the flawed Allerscan knockoff with Julian, I spent the last of my savings to secretly file a new, comprehensive patent for the SafeBite 2. It was a ghost patent, filed through a shell entity Valeria Rossi had set up to keep the Vance name off the radar. I wasn't just building a product anymore. I was building a trap. I was the architect of their downfall, and for the first time in 31 years, I didn't feel like a liability. I felt like a guardian. The launch of Allerscan was everything a Vance production was supposed to be. Glossy, expensive, and utterly hollow. Marcus appeared on the cover of several tech journals, wearing a suit that cost more than my first 2 years of college, talking about disrupting the safety sector with the very data he had stolen from my discarded hard drives. He and Julian Sterling had taken my early, flawed research, the version that struggled with electrochemical interference, and rushed it to market under the banner of Sterling Vance Innovations. They didn't care about the science. They cared about the IPO. They ignored the noise and the sensors, because, to men like Marcus, Noise is just something you drown out with a louder marketing budget. But reality has a way of asserting itself when lives are on the line. 6 weeks after their big launch, the secret shield I had built in my dark studio became the only thing standing between Apex Medical and total ruin. Reports began trickling in first as quiet emails to customer support, then as a deafening roar on social media. Allerscan was failing. It was giving green lights to food laced with almond dust and soy concentrates. It wasn't just a glitch, it was a medical catastrophe. 3 children in the Chicago suburbs ended up in the ICU within 48 hours, their parents having trusted a device that was nothing more than a polished lie. The second twist wasn't just that the product failed, it was the depth of the deception. Julian and Marcus hadn't just used my old data, they had forged my name on the safety certification logs to make the product look peer-reviewed. They thought that if they buried me deep enough, my name would only serve as a convenient scapegoat if things went south. But they didn't know about the shell entity Valeria had created, or the ghost patent I had filed for the nanofilter that actually worked. Apex Medical, which had been in secret talks to acquire Sterling Vance for a staggering sum, suddenly found itself staring down the barrel of a multi-billion-dollar class-action lawsuit. Their legal team began a frantic, forensic search for the true origin of the tech, and that's when they hit the secret shield wall. They realized that the Vance genius was holding an empty bag, while an anonymous entity, managed by a sharp lawyer named Rossi, held the only patent that could fix the sensor's lethal blindness. The $145 million wasn't just an offer anymore. It was a ransom the world was willing to pay to the only person who had actually done the work. While Marcus was busy trying to scrub his LinkedIn profile of the mashed potato jokes, the tide was coming in. And for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't the one who was about to drown. The air inside the McCormick Place ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the sterile, pressurized hum of a high-stakes medical conference. I stood in the back, shadowed by a massive marble pillar, watching the theater of my own erasure unfold on stage. Marcus was under the spotlight, looking every bit the golden boy my father had invested in, his hand resting casually on a podium that featured the Sterling Vance Innovations logo. Beside him stood Julian Sterling, wearing a smirk that suggested he had already spent his portion of the Apex buyout. They were presenting a slide deck full of breakthrough data I knew was riddled with the sensor blindness errors we had discovered at 2:43 a.m. in my studio. In the very front row sat Harrison and Eleanor. My mother's profile was regal, her smile fixed in that ceramic expression of maternal pride she only wore when Marcus was winning. My father was leaning forward, his white knuckle grip on his knees, a testament to how much of the family's liquidity he had tethered to Marcus's stolen narrative. They looked like the architects of a dynasty, blissfully unaware that the foundation was built on sand and forged signatures. The moderator, a senior executive from Apex Medical, stepped up to interrupt the presentation. "We have a historic announcement," he said, his voice amplified by the massive sound system until it vibrated in my chest. While Sterling Vance provided the initial spark, we realized during our deep dive due diligence that the core intellectual property, the only technology capable of the secret shield nanofiltration, belongs to a different entity. The room went into a cold, sudden hush. I saw Marcus's confident posture falter. His hand slipped from the podium. Julian Sterling's face turned a translucent shade of gray. The executive continued, "Apex has finalized a $145 million acquisition of the SafeBite platform, held by its sole inventor and CEO. Please welcome the true visionary behind the future of biochemical diagnostics, Clara Vance." I stepped out from behind the pillar. The rhythmic click of my heels on the polished hardwood felt like a metronome counting down the seconds of my family's reign. As I walked down the center aisle, 2,000 heads turned, a sea of whispers following my wake. I didn't look at the crowd, I looked at the front row. The moment our eyes met, I saw the structural failure of my father's reality. Harrison didn't look proud, he looked terrified. The liability he had kicked out into the rain was now the person who owned the very company he was desperate to partner with. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Her perfect family mask, cracking as she realized the girl she had smothered in silence was now the loudest voice in the room. I climbed the stairs to the stage, the light blindingly white, and I felt a strange, surgical calm. I wasn't there to scream or cry. I was there to reclaim my name from the people who had tried to turn it into a debt. As the executive handed me the microphone, the same one Marcus had just been using to lie, I turned to my brother. He was shaking. For the first time in 31 years, the golden boy was in the dark, and I was the one holding the light. I didn't let the silence drag on long enough for Marcus to find a lie he could sell. I simply gestured toward the wing of the stage, and Valeria Rossi walked out, her stride purposeful and her expression as sharp as a surgical blade. She wasn't just my lawyer. She was the architect of the structural failure about to bring their world down. She carried a thick, manila folder, the smoking gun my father had always taught Marcus to fear, though he had never expected his daughter to be the one holding the trigger. "Marcus," I said, my voice magnified and steady through the ballroom's sound system. "You and Julian thought you were clever when you accessed my discarded research logs at the Institute. You thought you were stealing the blueprint to a multi-million-dollar future." I looked over at Julian Sterling, who was now frantically whispering to an assistant, his face a sickly shade of gray under the stage lights. "But you forgot the first rule of engineering. Never build on a foundation you haven't verified. The data you stole was the noise I had purposely left behind. It was flawed, ungrounded, and as the recent ICU admissions prove, it was lethal." Valeria opened the folder and placed a series of documents onto the digital projector. High-resolution scans of safety certification logs filled the massive screens behind us. "These are the internal logs for Allerscan." Valeria addressed the room, her voice echoing with legal authority. "They contain the forged digital signatures of Dr. Clara Vance, used to bypass secondary safety reviews. These forgeries were executed from an IP address registered to Sterling Vance Innovations specifically, from Marcus Vance's private office." A collective, jagged gasp rippled through the audience. I watched Marcus's hand tremble as he reached for the podium to steady himself. He looked toward our father in the front row, a silent, desperate plea for the blue-chip protection he'd had his entire life. But Harrison Vance was staring at the screen, his face drained of color. He wasn't just watching his son fall. He was watching the total evaporation of the family's liquidity, every cent of which he had leveraged to fund Marcus's stolen narrative. The executive from Apex Medical stepped forward, his face a mask of corporate fury. "Effective immediately," he announced, "Apex Medical is terminating all negotiations with Sterling Vance. Furthermore, we will be cooperating fully with the federal investigation into medical fraud and document forgery." Marcus didn't argue. He couldn't. The golden boy simply collapsed back into a chair, his silk tie crooked, his eyes hollow. Two security guards moved toward Julian Sterling, who was already being intercepted by a man in a dark suit a federal investigator Valeria had paged an hour ago. I looked down at my parents. My mother, Eleanor, had buried her face in her hands, her ceramic mask of perfection finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. My father didn't look up. He looked like a man who had finally realized that when you bet everything on a lie, you lose the truth along with the money. I set the microphone down. It wasn't a drop, it was a placement. The job was finished. The days following the acquisition were filled with the white noise of success, legal signings, press releases, and the surreal sight of my face on the digital cover of Forbes. But the true resolution didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the quiet of my new home overlooking Lake Michigan, where the only sound was the rhythmic wash of the waves against the shore. Harrison and Eleanor tried one last time, appearing at my door not with an umbrella, but with a bouquet of expensive lilies and a practiced, trembling apology. My father spoke about family unity, and my mother mentioned misunderstandings, but their eyes kept drifting to the view, calculating the cost of the floor-to-ceiling glass. I didn't let them in. I stood on the threshold and realized that I finally understood the difference between a apology and reputation control. "I accept that you're sorry," I told them, my voice as steady as the horizon. But acceptance is not access. You spent 31 years treating me as an expense. You don't get to enjoy the dividends now that I've become an asset. As I closed the door, I didn't feel the jagged heat of revenge. I felt the cool, clean air of sovereignty. I walked over to the mantel and placed the original SafeBite prototype, the gray, 3D, printed one with the faint yellow stain of potatoes still visible in its ridges, on a custom marble stand. It sat there next to Leo's superhero drawing, a reminder of the night I stopped asking for permission to be great. The $145 million was just a number on a ledger, but this room, this silence, and the knowledge that I had saved lives without sacrificing my dignity, that was the true buyout. My name is Clara Vance, and I have learned that boundaries are not walls built for hate. They are the architecture of freedom. I am no longer a line item in my father's book. I am the author of my own. Clara Vance's journey isn't just a story about a $145 million buyout or a brilliant invention. It is a profound meditation on the architecture of the self and the courage it takes to stop seeking permission from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. The most painful truth of family betrayal is that it often wears the mask of concern or duty. We are taught that family is a sanctuary, but for many, it is a theater where our roles are pre-assigned based on how much we can be exploited. Clara was labeled a liability, not because she lacked value, but because her value didn't fit into her father's rigid allocation of capital. Her story teaches us that your worth is not a consensus. It is an objective reality that remains true even when the people closest to you choose to stay blind to it. The ultimate victory in this narrative is not the wealth, but the recovery of sovereignty. As Clara so poignantly stated, acceptance is not access. Forgiving someone for your own peace is a virtue, but opening the door to those who only show up when you are loud enough to be profitable is a mistake. Real boundaries are the walls we build to protect the light we fought so hard to find in the dark. Success may be the best revenge, but freedom, the kind where your identity is no longer a debt to be paid, is the only true recovery. What about you? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family to protect your own peace? Does Clara's acceptance is not access rule resonate with your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, please like this video and subscribe to join our community of resilient storytellers. Your support helps us bring more voices like Clara's into the light.